Well, welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming out. Dark March night. I hope you'll find this interesting. I should say a few words about Cheltenham for Europe. We were formed out of in Cheltenham, successful campaign, the referendum, when Cheltenham was at 55 or 56% voted to remain. After we had recovered from the great disappointment of the result, we established ourselves as a new pressure group in Cheltenham, affiliated to a wider Britain for Europe movement. And as many of you may know, there are other organisations like this up and down the country who share a common wish to remain close to the heart of Europe. More specifically, and forgive me just reading this bit, but it's important to get the words right. Cheltenham for Europe believes that it is in the UK's political, economic and social interests, and might add environmental interests too, to remain part of the EU. We believe that future generations have the best possible prospects as citizens of a free and united Europe. We believe the EU represents the values which we recognise as important values in Britain too, such as democracy, justice, tolerance, collaboration, human rights and the rule of law. And whilst no organisation or country is perfect, each of us is stronger when we're united. And that's a sort of common belief that we hope that many of you in this room will share too. So what have we done since we formed ourselves in about September? We've had a couple of public meetings, the second of which was addressed by Jonathan Porritt, many of you would know, an internationally recognised expert on the environment and enthusiast for international cooperation, not wholly uncritical of the EU at all. It was a very interesting and lively evening. We've created a very active Twitter account. We've had about 600 followers, I think we have, and a Facebook page, which is really worth looking at, and we're working on the website. We met our MP, Alex Chalk, who will be speaking to you in a moment, and tried to persuade him of the importance of resisting the rush to a hard Brexit. We will be meeting after our evening here this evening with Julie Girling, with another MEP, Claire Moody, and that's an important point because we come from all parties, we're not a particular party affiliation, cross-party partnership. We're organising a coach, and this may be of interest to many of you, to go to the pro-EU rally on Saturday the 25th of March, and if you're interested, I do hope you'll let us know. There'll be people here who will be happy to make a note of that, and I think we're charging £17.50 for the return journey. You won't be left in London, and you'll be carefully looked after when you're back. We've got later in the year, on 12th of May, we have AC Grady come and talk to us. He gives rousing speeches about Europe, and I'm sure he'll be one of those here. And also, we're hoping, I think we haven't got the venue yet, we've got the date, your neighbour, Alex Neil Carmichael is also going to come talk to us. So as you can see again, we're coming from all different parties and perspectives. We use the local media. You'll probably see from time to time letters in the Echo, often in response to other ones, BBC Gloucestershire and so forth. And we will be on the streets soon with a stall, talking to people and trying to encourage them to join us in our efforts to keep Britain as close as possible to the EU. And we'll make a special effort to engage younger people. One of the things that Jonathan Porritt said to us, and I look around the room and I can see he had a point, is that too many of the people who are associated with this campaign are, shall we say, the top side of 50. And we need to find younger people. And so we'll be particularly meeting people in the universities and the schools and discussing in the next few weeks how we can strengthen that engagement. Anyhow, that's just the background and where we are, and I hope those who are not already associated with us will come on this journey for the next 2 or 3 years. But now for this evening's business, I'm very pleased we've got 2 politicians, one from Parliament, one from the European Parliament, to speak to us. Alex's Chalk will be known to you all, but just in case you don't, he's your MP, I'm sure you know. And as well as being strikingly tall, he also appears frequently in the Echo as well. And you'll be saying a few words, I think, Alex, and then you're going to introduce Julie Girling, who is the Conservative MEP for the South West and Gibraltar. Okay, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Well, I will just say very few words. It's very kind of you actually to introduce me, because You shouldn't assume people know who I am. It wasn't that long ago that I knocked on a door in Charlton Kings. Door opened and this lady said, "Oh, I know who you are. You might be better than your brother, but we don't want David Miliband here." So it's very good of you to clarify. That is an entirely true story, by the way. So yes, really, I don't want to say very much other than to introduce our guest, who I really am absolutely delighted to see here, exactly as you've indicated, Member of Parliament for South West and Gibraltar. And Julie, I think, has been that MEP since 2009. She's an extremely diligent and effective MEP, I'm bound to say. It's not just because I share a party with her, it's because that is her reputation. And I commend to you, by the way, her excellent video blogs, which I shall be, once I have the courage, I will myself try to emulate, but they're very informative and absolutely excellent. Although, of course, she covers the entire territory of the South West and Gibraltar, I hope it's not too parochial for us to claim you as our own. This is a lady who was leader of Cotswold District Council, I think, for 3 years, and also sat as a councillor on Gloucestershire County Council, and was for a time, I think, cabinet member for the environment. But as I say, extremely well thought of, and I think one of the last times I campaigned with Julie was in the run-up to the referendum, and I was there with you outside Boots. Now, what you didn't know, Julie, is I'd actually parked my bike, my trusty bike, very close to the railings there, and after we'd stopped campaigning for that day, I went back and it was gone. The bike was taken, but I don't hold you responsible. It was a sign. It was a portent of doom. But I don't hold you responsible for that. It really is my very great pleasure that you have to introduce you. I'm absolutely delighted you've come here. I know you will be a fascinating speaker, as you always are, and I, to you, introduce the very great Julie Girdling.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alex. That's quite a build-up that I've got to live up to. You will see that I have not brought with me a great long speech. The reason for that is I've given up writing speeches about Brexit the way forward because things keep happening, so they kind of change. It's a really weird thing because things keep happening, but nothing happens. As in, it's been a strange period. And I thought it would be best if I just told you a little bit about me and my position on the subject, and then a little bit about what's happening in Brussels from my perspective as a member of the Parliament, and maybe where I see the negotiations going, and then really plenty of time for questions and a discussion. It's a nice sized group that you can actually sort of just almost still have a discussion. So, my position as an MEP, I've been there now, this is my ninth year. So I'm pretty much part of the furniture. I've certainly gone through the bedding in period. I know what I'm doing. So I guess to me, Brexit's on a personal level, and I'll get this one out of the way, because one of the difficulties as an MEP talking about Brexit, all the way through the campaign and since, has been that our attitudes, our opinions are discounted by many people because, well, you would say that, wouldn't you, because it's your job. And yes, there's some truth in that. Of course, I'm deeply unhappy that I'm going to be losing my job. Wouldn't anybody be? But I'm more deeply unhappy because I do feel that, having been there for the amount of time I've been there, I've done my apprenticeship, I understand how everything works. I'm deeply embedded into the organisation and the structure of the Parliament, and I feel that I'm really beginning to get something out of it on behalf of my constituents. I really know how to operate, and I think Alex, as a relatively new member at Westminster, will tell you these organisations are not easy to integrate into. You have to pay your dues before you get to the point where you start to get elected to chairmanships, before you start to be allowed to be the Parliament's. In the case of the European Parliament, we have a system of rapporteurships whereby individual bits of legislation are brought forward by individual MEPs, much more actually like the American system, where you will meet a congressman who will take a bill onto the floor of the House and move it through. We tend to work that way. Very different from the Westminster system of a government introducing and an MP's job being either to support or oppose that government. I know it's bigger than that, but in the legislative sense. So I've actually got to the point where I'm quite good at that now, and it does seem a bit of a shame that we're going to throw all that experience away, but so be it. That's apparently what I heard described the other day as an overwhelming majority of people voted. That's what I mean about how things change quickly, because now apparently it was an overwhelming majority, where we all know it was actually fairly tight, even nationally. Of course, it's an interesting comment on our politics that it divides by constituencies, so in such an interesting way. But it's absolutely the case that if it were to divide on constituencies, then it would be an even stronger vote. There would be an even much more than 52% of the Commons would be pro-Brexit. I can't remember, I worked it out. It's closer to 70, which is quite shocking, really. But that's just the way the constituencies divide. So, where was I on this? Well, I campaigned very strongly to stay. I believe that our place is much better in Europe rather than outside it. My single most important thing that I want somebody to prove to me is that anything is going to get better by leaving. And everything we see in the way that the debate is moving is always towards saying, well, it's not, we can get that back, we can stay as we are, we can make sure that we're not disadvantaged by all of this sort of tone of voice, which for me is, well, surely that's not what people voted Brexit for. They voted Brexit for something that was going to be better. So where is that better? Because if I could see that better, maybe I could go for it. And I always say that this is for me politically, something about which I feel very passionately, and that does put me at odds with my party now, and that's something no doubt we'll come on to discuss. But I feel very passionately about it. I feel it's a tremendous error, a huge mistake. And yet, I have to be honest, it's the thing about which I hope I'm most wrong in my life. I mean, I hope I'm not right. I hope I am exaggerating. I hope I am over-egging that pudding, because for me and my family, we have a future. I have a son who graduated just before, as Brexit was going on. I mean, what's the future? And so I don't want to be right, but I haven't seen anything since the 23rd of June that's made me think that anything is actually any better than I thought it was going to be. And the false promises of, well, we haven't had a crash in the economy. No, we haven't, but we haven't left. And some of the things that were said about what was going to happen after we left, after we voted to leave, of course, have proven to be untrue. And I'm delighted that they've proven to be untrue. I'm absolutely delighted that we didn't have to have an immediate budget. I'm delighted that inflation hasn't rocketed. I'm delighted that unemployment hasn't rocketed. But, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not convinced that these things aren't going to happen. They just didn't happen straight after the vote. And we do see some rather ominous signs of both economically and I think socially as well, that things are changing and that they will continue to change. And so for me personally, you can see it's quite an emotional and personal thing. But also when I put my hard political or economic hat on, I'm also in the position where I'm looking very strongly for signs of positive change. I could give you a number of examples of small things that would be easier. I deal in the European Parliament with agriculture, environment, fisheries, that sort of thing. And we have a number of issues around European regulation, for example, on agricultural chemicals. And yes, I can see that if we were legislating, regulating separately for the UK, we could have a little bit more UK-specific policy on that. But frankly, that's pretty minor compared with some of the big issues. And there's no reason why, under the current EU system, we couldn't carve out. We have a pretty good deal. We carved out of a number of things that other member states are part of, things like the Schengen agreement, and I don't need to, you're all interested in Europe, so you'll all know what they are, but we had a pretty unique deal anyway, and we had the ability to build on that deal. So I don't think that the nuclear option of leave was necessary, but I need to deal with the issue of democracy, because I'm told when I make this point that I'm not listening to the democratic will of the people. So how do I see that? Well, for me, referenda are not the way that we govern here in the UK. We never have. They're an extremely difficult way to do it, particularly with a population of 60 million. The Greek agora was great, if you were a man, instantly. It wasn't so great. Not so great if you had microsomes, but nevertheless, that model, fine. When you're talking about a small city-state in ancient Greece, when you're talking about 60 million in a modern developed democracy, is it really a sensible way to govern? Because how do you then tweak, alter, change anything in the future when you can always go back and say, well, we voted for that? But I have some sympathy with those people who have for many years campaigned to leave, because they looked back to 1975 and said, look at that referendum, why should we be governed by that? My answer to that is both referenda didn't need to take place and probably shouldn't have. But there you go. We deal with what we have. So how do I answer people who want to leave the European Union and tell me that I'm flying in the face of democratic majority? Well, my answer to that is that we are a democracy. We have elections every 5 years, and that's the way in which we govern for a reason. We govern that way because then, if mistakes are made, we can correct them. If we want to change things slightly, we can make that change. And as I always say to American friends, and I have a number of American friends who are incredibly unhappy about having President Trump, as I always say to them, yeah, it's bad, I can see that, but you only have to have him for 4 years. You can change it. I can't change this referendum. I have no mechanism to do that. And therefore, that makes me extremely unhappy that now my democratic right to make a change has been taken away. So that's my position, fair and square. And it does raise some issues for me in terms of my party. I've been a member of the Conservative Party for 40 years. I know, it sounds impossible, doesn't it? But I joined when I was at university. And I've been with them all that time, ups and downs. There's been things that I didn't like, things that I really did like over the years. And I work on the basis of the 80-20 rule. Parties in the UK particularly are broad coalitions. Even places like the Netherlands have 10 parties in Parliament. They work on coalition governments. We've only tried that once, certainly in my memory. We tend to work with the coalitions being within our parties. You know, there are wide views, differences of view. We see it now in the Labour Party, we see it in the Liberal Democrats, we're certainly seeing it in the Conservative Party. So long as you can operate on that sort of 80% of what they do, I'm okay with. I'm committed to. And through the years, there have been a number of issues that I thought, I don't really much like that. And certainly, when I was in local government here in Gloucestershire, through some Tory rule, and it wasn't great. I found myself once or twice really with a problem, but generally I could stick with it. But this to me is very, very fundamental. It's fundamental in that it's changing our country quite radically. And if I can't be in step with that, where do I go? There isn't anywhere to go, actually, in terms of party political terms for me. There's no other party that I would ever join. But of course, I lose my job in 2019 anyway. So it doesn't really matter what I say. it's more difficult for parliamentary colleagues like Ali, who do have to work within the system. And for me, I'm really struggling because I'm now a rebel. Do I look like a rebel? I'm a pretty conventional person. I've had a pretty conventional political career. There's nothing very rebellious about me. But I find that I'm not actually in tune with what is the all-consuming political issue of the day with my party. And that's a problem. But I'm not leaving. And there have been a number of Conservatives who have left. And if you follow on Facebook and Twitter, I've seen some fantastic pieces put on, particularly by councillors, where they've gone through their justification for it, and it's actually really moving. And but I'm not doing that because I believe that I'm more useful where I am, because the Conservative Party is not entirely pro-Brexit. There are significant parts of it who support our membership of the European Union. But since the referendum, there's no focus for that activity, because none of us want to be seen to be being disloyal. We've got a new Prime Minister, we've got a lot of good stuff going on. None of us want to be seen to be disloyal, and also, frankly, I don't want to take myself out the tent. So I take myself out the tent, I can no longer influence what's going on inside it. And whilst I'm still in situ for the next 2 years, I have that opportunity. So how do I do that as an MEP? So far, as members of the European Parliament, we have little to do on a day-to-day basis with the Brexit preparations. Certainly on the surface. Now underneath, that depends on your relationship with the government department that you work with. So I told you, I'm environment, agriculture, sit on the fisheries committee. I'm also gender equality, but that's sort of slightly different. So all of that comes under DEFRA. And I've worked with DEFRA ministers. It's never the same ministers, of course. One problem with the UK government, they change ministers far too frequently. But I work with DEFRA ministers, have done for nearly a decade now. So yes, I have been talking to them about what it's going to look like, what the shape's going to be, but it's no more than talking. It's not official consultations. I'm not pretending I'm sitting at the table with them writing the plans. But because what they're doing at the moment is they are gathering information. They are genuinely doing this, and very often people say to me, well, they're just like rabbits in the headlights, they're not doing anything. Not the case. All government departments are heavily focused on looking at the options. Very heavily focused on gathering the data, seeing what possibilities there are, what other models there are in other parts of the world, what other models there are in other parts of Europe. There are all kinds of models to look at, because we've got the EFTA model, we've got the Swiss model. There are different ways of dealing with Europe, but still not being in the European Union. And all of those are being looked at. From an agriculture point of view, there is a whole new agricultural policy going to have to be written, and that process is underway. There are a number of issues like agencies. Probably there are 22 European agencies, which most of you have probably never heard of any of them. One is called the European Medicines Agency, is in London, actually headquartered in London in Canary Wharf. It employs, I think it's 6,000 people, so it's a fairly major employer, and it regulates medicines, pharmaceuticals for the entire European Union. It's funded by our European tax money, and it's very sad that during the Brexit campaign there was no talk about what that money goes for, because people just talked about it as a lump of money we give to those nasty bureaucrats and they don't do anything with it. Well, actually, they're spending, all of us, are spending tens of millions on decommissioning Chernobyl at the moment. massive amount of money from that goes into that, which I think we'd all have to admit is pretty important for the whole of Europe, not just the UK or Poland that happens to be relatively close. But if you remember, those of us who are old enough, I think probably all of us are, when Chernobyl went up, how frightening that was. That reactor is still not permanently capped. And if we just leave it to the Russians to do it, it's not getting done. It's actually European money that's doing it. Things like these agencies, they are funded centrally through the European pot. So, the European Medicines Agency in London, if we leave Europe, when we leave Europe, we are technically no longer going to be part of that system. So somebody has got to decide whether we'll continue. Now, if we continue, we have to make a payment, because obviously it's not being paid for through our normal route anymore. That has to be negotiated. So first of all, we have to decide whether it's going to be cost effective to stay in it, or would it be more cost effective to replicate it? Well, I don't even need to see the spreadsheet. I think instinctively to know it'd be cheaper to stay in it and make a contribution. But that contribution's got to be decided. Having done that, will it stay in London? Probably not. However, there are a couple of good reasons why maybe it will stay in London. So these things are all still unknowns, and these are the sorts of things, and they're rather detailed. They're not the big macro political issues. Governments are not interested in what I think about that. But where I deal with these agencies, etc., where I deal with environmental issues, they are interested in what I think about that. So those dialogues are going on. They've not long started, to be fair. Up until the end of last year, there was very little coming out in terms of detail of what the plan A, plan B, or C, D, if there were any other plans, were likely to be. But they have started now, so we are getting involved with that to a certain extent. But you can imagine the size of that. And what I think worries me a little bit in my associations with government is that so much resource is being sucked out of government, which is already under pressure in terms of cutting costs, that the day-to-day, everyday goings on are just not going on. And again, I come back to my fundamental question, which is, okay, how is this better? Where does this lead us in terms of a bright new world? When we're not able to do our day-to-day stuff, we haven't yet got on the table a plan for what it's going to look like. So, on the one hand, I'm not a person who will say to you that just because I don't agree that we should leave the European Union, I think life's going to be utterly dreadful outside of it. I think it could be. I think it's got a quite high chance it will be, but it doesn't have to be. Because, yes, we can do all these things ourselves. But we need to clearly evaluate whether it's worth doing them. Do we get anything more for not just financially, but socially, as a society? Do we gain anything from it or not? And it's how we make that evaluation in the long run that I'm really interested in seeing how that pans out at the end of the 2 years. So as we go into Article 50 being triggered any day, I heard it's next Wednesday, but I don't know if the rumour is in Westminster.
Good a day as any.
But I can't think why it was next Wednesday, but I heard it's next Wednesday. So as we go into this period, once Article 50 is triggered, then that does start a process, as you all know. And I see my role in that process as being trying to find ways of forging links within the parliamentary system in Europe, which is obviously where I work. You will know that the European Parliament has to sign off the deal, much to everyone's irritation, it seems, having complained that Europe's not democratic enough. Now apparently the European Parliament shouldn't be able to sign something off. But as we move towards that, the European Parliament will have a role in the negotiation. Now, it's highly unlikely that British MEPs will have a direct role, for fairly obvious reasons. The MEPs from the other 27 will. However, of course, we have very strong links with those people. Some of those people I can honestly call friends. Some I can honestly call enemies. But if we have that strong link, then we need to be doing all we can to try and cut the logjam, because there is a logjam on this negotiation. And that is that currently Michel Barnier, who is negotiating on behalf of the Commission and the Council, has been very clear that he will not advance on a parallel basis into any negotiations until the financial settlement is made. This is not helpful, as I have tried to point out in Brussels. This is very unhelpful. Maybe it's understandable, but it's very unhelpful. We need to break that logjam. So I see it as my job in the near future, in the next few months, to try to initiate discussions to try to break that downright hostility, actually break it down, because if we spend the rest of this year arguing about the 60 billion, we are not going to get a deal by March 2019. We need to get through that very quickly, or personally I think it should come at the end, because I just mentioned around the agencies, and I'm using that as just one small example, but there's a cost there to the EU, and there's a cost to us. So how can you decide how much we owe them on an ongoing basis until you've sorted that out? So we need to reverse this. Now, I know from Barnier, it's his initial salvo into this, but we mustn't let it settle, and we mustn't have, and I hate to say this because he's the Foreign Secretary, but Boris this morning saying we should have handbags at dawn, it's not helpful, because that's just setting up for a confrontation. The only people who lose from a confrontation are us. Now, I know that you all belong to an organisation that, well, perhaps you don't all, but those of you who belong to the organisation that's organised tonight want to reverse Brexit, want to stop it and reverse it. Okay, but put that to one side, it's happening. We want to get the best deal out of it, and in order to do that we have to play down this rhetoric of conflict and confrontation, because we will not get a good deal out of that, and it's really important that we do. Even though we don't like it, it's important that we do. So my job I see as being part of that process. I'm involved in things, and I mentioned fisheries. My goodness, that's going to be confrontational. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because there is a supposition, and it was used, I thought, horribly in the referendum campaign. The fisheries industry was used as an example of where we could completely reverse everything, and they could have back all their boats, and it's legally, that's just not possible. So we need to get into those arguments, those discussions, those negotiations very quickly, because they'll take a while. So as an MEP, what am I going to be doing for the next couple of years? That's what I'm going to be doing. But also, has to be said, it's business as usual for me. I've actually never been busier in the European Parliament, because my instruction from the Prime Minister is to dig in. Don't let them take away any British privilege, don't let them take away any of our rights as MEPs, because we are members of the European Union, until the day we actually leave. So I carry on with the work that I've always done, and I'm currently, yesterday in fact, and this may be historic because I suspect I will be the last British MEP to be appointed to a rapporteurship of a legal regulation. So yesterday I was appointed to negotiate aviation ETS, emissions trading scheme, which is a bit of a hot potato actually. But just using it as an illustration that we are still doing our day job, if you like, as well as all of this extracurricular activity around Brexit. How do people feel about it? How do our colleagues feel? Somebody's bound to ask that, so I'll answer it now. It's mixed. Some colleagues rub their hands in glee at getting rid of the Brits because we've always been, you know, piece of grit in their eye. We never like the way they do things. We always want a special deal. Great, go. One of them said to me, "I think you have a British phrase, bugger off." It was said in a friendly way, but you know. And then others are distraught, particularly countries that look to the British pragmatism, that element of the mix, and they say, well, we're really going to miss you because you bring this element of common sense to discussions, etc. So it's a very mixed bag. But the one thing I can tell you is that outside of the normal party political hostilities, there is no hostility. Certainly not to me. I simply haven't experienced it on a personal level at all. So I'm very hopeful that I will be able to play a strong part in making sure that we keep relations within the realms of civility, and also we are able to make some gains. So I think I'll finish there. That's probably enough my voice for a moment, but I'm very happy to answer whatever questions you might have.